We're going to give you 2-3 minutes to introduce yourself, like we're leaving everybody.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Buenas noches y felicitaciones a todos. Es mi placer estar esta noche con ustedes. It's a real pleasure for me to be with all of you here tonight, here at the Shabazz Center. Honored to be in the presence of the Shabazz sisters. And also, I want to thank, please, let's give the Shabazz sisters. And I want to thank the Northern Manhattan Democrats for Change, as well as the Barack Obama Democratic Club of Upper Manhattan, and of course the Shabazz Center for co-sponsoring this very special event tonight, an event where we will be able to talk about many issues of grave importance to this community and by turn the entire city of New York. For the last 3 years and change, I've had the extreme privilege of being New York City Comptroller. Not an easy time to be Chief Financial Officer of anything, let alone the great city of New York. But I've had the privilege to work alongside our great leaders here, Adriano, Espaillat, our state senator, Ydanis Rodriguez, our city council member, and of course, somewhat new to the block, but not new in any way because she's really hit the ground running so quickly, our new assembly member, Gabriela, Rosa. We've worked on so many issues related to affordable housing that Ydanis Rodriguez just told us how we are still so short, where gentrification is driving many of the longtime residents out of this community. We talked about the need to create more jobs, especially as my office continues to report the sad reality that there are economic unemployment disparities that affect communities of change more so than other communities, and that's a situation we have to correct going forward. Issues with regard to the small business owners being driven out by skyrocketing rents because landlords commercial landlords are often unreasonable with the renewal terms, and issues of education and educational equity. I'm so proud that with the efforts of our local elected officials and their leadership and advocacy, we were able to stop Juan Pablo Duarte, PS 132, from closing and making sure that they actually are able to continue to educate the kids in this community. School closures are not the solution. We need to improve the schools, provide the leadership and the resources to ensure that our schools can continue teaching the kids, especially in an ever-evolving community like this, a community that is very similar to the community I grew up in Flushing, Queens, where we had a tremendous influx of immigrants over the decades, combined with a long-standing population of die-hard New Yorkers who really want to see the city continue to prosper and succeed.
Thank you so much. We're going to cut it so that we make sure we have enough time for questions for you. Thank you so much for coming tonight. You brought up the plight of small business owners in these neighborhoods. And I'm wondering if you would go on the record as supporting a rent control for retail spaces throughout the city.
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. In fact, that's a question that I'm very familiar with because before I became a city controller, I was a member of the city council and co-sponsor of a bill in the city council that would not have, it wouldn't have been rent control per se, but it would have instituted a system where there would be some kind of arbitration between landlords, commercial landlords, and the business owner tenants when the leases became up for renewal. It is the high rents, the rent increases that were the #1 cause of the closing of so many hundreds of small businesses across the city. So the answer to your question is yes, I do support those kinds of measures. They are necessary to ensure that there's some form of stability within our neighborhoods, and small businesses are very much a part of the fabric of the neighborhoods. But I would go a little further. I would talk about how small businesses, and even Mayor Bloomberg talks about this quite a bit, small businesses are the job growth engines in the city of New York. In fact, the majority of New Yorkers are employed by not the largest corporations, but by small businesses in the neighborhoods. And yet, when you look at the so-called economic incentives, the tax breaks, they generally go to the big corporations, the big private developers that are supposedly meant to create jobs. And yet, in a number of audits that I conducted, we found that the majority of those subsidies went to companies that wound up creating no jobs and didn't give the money back to the people of New York City. I propose that we give a tax break to the small business owners, to the entrepreneurs in our neighborhoods that actually create jobs in neighborhoods that need those jobs.
So in keeping with the discussion about developers coming into neighborhoods, when speaking to residents in this area and throughout the city, many have told me that they are very concerned about the balance between keeping healthy neighborhoods and bringing development to an area, specifically around hospital complexes, universities that are taking very large swaths of the land around their schools to develop and promising in turn jobs for the community, etc. How do you balance the needs of these schools that are growing or hospitals that are providing services in a community with often violating zoning agreements in order to grow and violating the will of the residents around them?
Well, that's a great question, and I know we've had a number of, shall we say, debates and discussions with institutions like Columbia University up here in these neighborhoods. This is an issue that I took on when I first became Comptroller. The issue of development and balancing huge development with the needs of local communities is something that we need to examine very closely going into the future. I believe that when the community is involved, from local elected officials to community boards and community-based organizations, when they get together with developers and the city, including entities like the Economic Development Corporation, they can, and in the past they have shown some success in crafting agreements, community-based agreements that would allow the developers to get the resources they need to build what they want, but at the same time take care of specific needs that the community has. For example, affordable housing, parkland, local jobs, other public amenities. These community agreements, community benefits agreements can work. But very quickly, unfortunately, they have not been policed. They have not been enforced. Once the developers get what they need, years later, there's no mechanism to ensure that the community benefits agreements provisions are actually enforced and implemented. In my administration, we would continue to encourage these kinds of community-based dialogues, but we would set in place mechanisms to ensure that the promises from the developers and from the big corporations are actually fulfilled, even years later. And I will refer you to a report that I had commissioned and we completed within 6 months. It was published in September of 2010. It is on my website. It is not necessarily the most stimulating reading, so try to read it in the morning right after you have coffee. But take a look at the report that I did on community benefits agreements.
Excellent.
Thank you. I'm glad somebody read it.
I want to move on to the budget, since your office, your office pretty much monitors how New York City spends its money. And New York City budget has been increasing for the past 12 years, let's say. It was, when Bloomberg started, it was 55 billion, now it's over $100 billion. And there's a lot of resources that our community needs. And the budget keeps on increasing, and those resources are not very well distributed in those communities. What are you planning on doing to stretch the budget, if it can be stretched before it even explodes one of these days?
Well, thank you very much for that question. The budget, New York City has a huge budget. We're like something like the fifth largest government in the United States. Of course, in comparison to the federal government, state of California, state of New York, a couple of other states. It's $70 billion a year annually now. When I first started as a member of the city council, which was the first year that Mayor Bloomberg was mayor, The budget that we voted on was $38 million. So the budget has essentially doubled during this administration's tenure. You know, that's one way to be able to control the finances very well is by continuing to double the budget. But that's a discussion for another day. The point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of money in the city of New York. When the mayor says there's no money for this or for that, actually, there's a lot of money in the city of New York. It's just a question of how we prioritize that spending. You know, it doesn't make any sense to me when we continue to exempt big corporations like could you imagine that insurance companies in the city of New York are exempt from the general corporation tax, the most basic business tax there is in the city of New York, and yet insurance companies are exempt from that. That's costing us $300 million a year. $300 million a year could pay for pretty much everything that is in public discussion. We wouldn't have to close any firehouses or threaten the closures of firehouses. All the after-school programs would be restored. The child daycare center slots would be restored. There would be no talk of closing senior centers. All of that simply by closing this 30-year-old loophole that I think people just forgot about, but needs to be closed right now. So there's a lot of money in the city's budget. It's a matter of prioritizing, and I would prioritize in favor of community development, taking care of our kids, taking care of our seniors, instead of taking care of the big insurance companies.
Affordable housing is a big issue in this community and communities throughout New York City. What do you consider affordable, taking on one of the questions from the audience? Since it's driving a lot of people out of, you know, Brooklyn, Manhattan, New York City as a whole.
I think that the question of affordable housing is always, what is the cutoff? And when, you know, I do believe that the area median income does not necessarily apply equally across the board to all the boroughs of New York City. In Manhattan, it's very difficult to compare to the area median income when in fact it's much lower than what you would actually expect in Manhattan. If you were somehow able to calculate the mean income for Manhattan residents, which right now I believe is not available, then the housing cutoff or the income cutoff would be much higher, and therefore it means that the fewer residents would actually be eligible for the current standards that are in place right now. I believe that there should be some distinction between different boroughs, and certainly distinction for the city of New York as a whole, as opposed to the rest of the metropolitan or northeast region. But getting to affordable housing itself, I think there's a tremendous amount of potential. There is a lot of value intrinsic in the land all across the 5 boroughs, including parts of Manhattan. There are areas that have the potential for rezoning in a way that unlocks a huge amount of economic value instantly. Economic value that can, yes, generate profits for the developers that take the risk, but a lot of that economic development can be reserved to build the actual affordable housing units. The cost of this, of course, would be somewhat of an increased density in certain neighborhoods. But I think given the fact that we expect 1 million more people in the city of New York, by 2030, the projection is that the population of New York City will approach 9.5 million people. We have to recognize that increased density is going to be a little bit of a fact of life, and we have to prepare for the population increase. And that means building the affordable housing now.
But once the affordable housing is built, which we can give examples like Williamsburg, for example, a lot of the communities were not included in those units that were built, where there was a lot of space, a lot of, you know, different projects. How can you assure that the community can benefit from plans like that?
And in fact, that's a complaint that I've heard over the years. So one of the things I've done as controller is audit HPD's process by which they select which families would get these affordable housing units. We have found that they had still employed what is called the garbage bag procedure. which is they basically put everybody's name in a big garbage bag, they shuffle the garbage bag, throw it on the floor, and then supposedly randomly choose names off of that pile. That is certainly not a way to choose which families get affordable housing, and is ripe for extreme abuse and favoritism. We've changed that process. HPD has agreed and has in fact changed the procedure to really to a much more automated, computerized random selection process. But the problem is that there are too few housing units being built and becoming available. And so these lotteries, it's almost like winning the lotto if you get an affordable apartment. The demand is this big, and the supply, even with the new supply, is still very short. What we need to do is really create wholesale affordable housing, and I do believe that inclusionary zoning is going to be the way to go.
Thank you, Comptroller. I have a question for you, as would be expected, yes? You were at Ydanis Towers just last week, and you had called, as you have frequently, for stop and frisk to be ended. And people there, the organizations that were there, had a great deal of information to share. And in East Harlem in particular, it's been ranked the #1 precinct, an area where stop and frisk is prevalent. Certainly in Washington Heights as well, you'll find that of the 700, forgive me, in 2011, 6,000 were conducted of the 700,000. Very few of these result in any meaningful action. As for your call to end it, what precisely would you then say would be an as effective policy to Commissioner Ray Kelly and Mayor Bloomberg, who argue it's actually a terrific deterrent? Look at the crime numbers.
How much time do I get for this? All right, I'll try to be as quick as possible. First of all, I want to thank all the residents here who were able to make it to my Las Octavitas celebration last week at Ydanis Towers. It's a great event that celebrates an important holiday for many New Yorkers. You know, when you read news reports about 700,000 people a year being stopped and frisked, almost all of whom have done absolutely nothing wrong, you figure it's going to be a news report about some third world dictatorship somewhere else in the world. You certainly don't expect to read about it in America, and certainly not in the city of New York. Layer on top of that the fact that almost every one of these people who were stopped and frisked and did nothing wrong are black or brown, people of color. It is impossible to deny that this is racial profiling, which is actually prohibited by NYPD standards in the first place. It's undemocratic, it is racial profiling, it has no place in the city of New York, period. It has created a huge sense of distrust in many communities across the city. The level of distrust to the point where I believe people are now unsafe because of the proliferation of this tactic that I do not believe actually works. Your question of what should be done. What should be done is the NYPD, and I know they're capable of this, and this is what's practiced in other major cities, focused deterrence. Focused deterrence, where the police department know pretty much where the baddest apples are. Communities generally know where the most criminal elements are, who the bad guys are, and where they are.
But wouldn't then Commissioner Kelly respond to you and say that that's the reason that these particular neighborhoods that are so plagued by crime, in fact, are the ones that are getting the most attention as regards to stopping this policy and stops?
And I would argue that they should focus on these areas. But the tactic is not stop and frisk. It is focused deterrence, because focused deterrence acknowledges the reality that generally the bad elements are known. Why not just focus your efforts and resources on the bad elements in a particular neighborhood, as opposed to assuming that anybody and everybody is potentially bad, and then stopping everybody, even though almost all of them did nothing wrong. So let's focus limited police resources on strategies that actually work, that have been proven successful in other cities. Let's stop the stop and frisk, because I don't believe it works. I think it has actually made neighborhoods less safe. We have to put an end, not mend. I don't think it needs to be changed, because I think it's done too much damage already. It needs to be abolished. And only then can we really focus the NYPD on reducing overall crime.
And this is a two-parter, and we must be quick. Then, do you have a sense, you were critical earlier today and this week about the focusing on someone with substantial education credentials for that post. Would you have now a sense of who you need and what you need in that particular person to be your police commissioner? Since you've got a sense of what you want your commissioner to do, do you have a sense of who that is and what qualities you're looking for?
Okay, I've said it many times, and today I released a report that showed that I believe the school's chancellor should have an educational background. Sometimes things are pretty much common sense, and you say there ought to be a law. Well, actually, it is a law that the chancellor should have an educational background. It's just that under the Bloomberg administration, they routinely sought a waiver from that state law. For the police commissioner, I think the police commissioner should have a law enforcement background. And I also believe that in the ranks of the NYPD, we have lots of people in the NYPD right now who could fit the bill of a police commissioner. But it's not only the police commissioner that I believe we need new blood for. It is much of the top ranks of the NYPD. This is a police force that must adapt to the changing neighborhoods across the city of New York. And we have a whole crop of NYPD captains and inspectors who are ready to step up to the next challenge. And they are the ones that I believe we should draw the talent from to lead the NYPD. It's not just the police commissioner as one person, but it is the top ranks of the entire force.
You are unapologetically often critical of the mayor. What do you think he's done well?
Look, I'm not, I don't try to give anybody a hard time. But sometimes it's part of my job as an independently elected comptroller. This is why both of the clubs here tonight supported me in 2009 to be comptroller, to be independent and not to hold back. And I think the mayor has done, possibly some good things. No, I think in his first tenure, in his first term of office, which I was a big supporter of Mayor Bloomberg. In fact, I was on his transition team when he first took office in 2002. He did spend quite a bit more time in the boroughs outside Manhattan. He was focused on economic development, and as a council member, I've worked alongside his administration to foster greater economic development in Flushing, the area that I proudly represented. In his second term, though, somehow, everything that we worked together on the first term got thrown out the window. And I'm still not sure exactly why that happened. I suspect that he might have lost focus in the quest to become president of the United States of America. I don't know, but I think there are some things that he did well, particularly in the first term. The second term, things got a little bit distracted, and the third term was just absolutely illegal. It should never have happened.
We're going to have to read some questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask you to be brief, please, so I can read more questions of the audience.
Well, don't ask me questions that require long responses.
Yeah, not my questions for once. But everybody's concerned about education. Some of the candidates have asked for a moratorium on school closures. If a school is underperforming and you've tried everything and everything has failed, what do you do, and what will you tell the parents of those kids? And normally in certain neighborhoods, if schools keep underperforming.
That is a big theoretical question, because I don't think the Department of Education even gets to that point at this juncture. I have called a long time ago for a moratorium on school closures and a moratorium on school co-location. Because I believe that the Department of Education is just shuffling things around, playing a shell game with our students. It's not actually contributing to the educational quality of our schools. If there are too many cases that have been documented in recent years where schools were closed, but a year, 2 years before that action actually took place, or before the recommendation by the Department of Education to close that school actually occurred, that there were signs that the school was going down the wrong path and they needed either additional services, additional resources, or additional guidance and support from the Department of Education itself. And the department just failed, and not only failed to deliver the resources, but basically left them hanging, and flooded the school with additional students that were special needs, or perhaps English language learners, possibly because the charter schools that were being set up didn't have to admit as many English language learners, as many special needs students, and therefore those students got diverted to the schools that were already having having severe difficulties. That kind of endless cycle of lack of support and of diversion of more needy students actually contributed to the Department of Education's case that these schools had to be closed. So I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question that if everything has been tried and failed, then perhaps we should close the school. I don't think in many of these cases the department actually tried to save these schools from being closed in the first place.
One more thing, an audience member asked if you recognize that the money exists and it's just a matter of prioritizing in the budget. If you win, can you identify any forces that may prevent you from putting this community and others like this one as a high priority?
The insurance company lobby. They're going to fight us tooth and nail. I am going to try very hard to get rid of that exemption that costs us $300 million annually. They're going to try very hard. It's going to take support from the state legislature because they'll require a change in state law. And the lobbyists will be out there. But I know with staunch community advocates in our legislators, such as Senator Espaillat and Assemblymember Rosa and others from New York City, I think we can win that battle. So they're gonna, look, I am interested in change. 2013 will be a great year for change. But change does not come for free. Change does not happen without a lot of pushback. I have had a lot of pushback. I have had an interesting year where they've basically thrown everything, all these allegations and insinuations at me, basically thrown everything in the kitchen sink at me. I'm not worried about that because I know the stove is on its way. And they'll tee up the refrigerator after that. But there are changes that I do believe are necessary for the city of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller. Thank you very much. You get one more minute.
Very quickly, I just want to say that I find it amazing that I could stand before you today in this kind of capacity, both in my current official capacity as well as a hopeful for this year's big elections. This is something that I am way past anything I dreamed of. Growing up here in New York City, growing up as an immigrant, tengo el orgulloso de ser inmigrante. Adriano has dubbed me El Chino de Bonao. In all honesty, I'm not from the DR. I was born in Taiwan, nació en Taiwan, hecho en Taiwan. If you look at my neck. And this, to have the opportunity to talk about these issues that affect our community, that affect our city and our collective future, I am just so honored to be able to stand before you here today. And I look forward to discussing and debating with all of you and the rest of the city the important issues that will affect our collective future in the months to come. Thank you so much for this great opportunity. God bless. Y que Dios los bendiga.